A couple of years ago, I remember telling a big group of people at a talk that I started out of fear, slash, I started out of anxiety, and I stayed out of love. This is a concept that I was really proud of coming up with when I started out as a climate activist, but ultimately, it isn't true. I kind of lied. I didn't necessarily start out of fear, I started out of anger. The fear came first, but it's not what made me start. And today, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about climate anxiety, the paradoxical nature between anxiety and inaction, and what I like to call Schrodinger's anxiety. What climate anxiety actually is and what it's not. A little bit of overview on today's topic. So, climate anxiety, in terms of definitions, right, is this feeling of overwhelming doom, like impending doom. It can also be the feeling that there's catastrophes about to happen. It can be anxiety about the future. And these are things that I'm sure are not foreign to anyone watching this video. If you clicked on a video about climate, I'm pretty sure you have experienced climate anxiety at least once in your life. For me, growing up, climate anxiety was paralyzing. It always has been. And paralyzing in the sense that I would have days where I'd be on my bed and all I'm thinking to myself is, the problem is too big. There's nothing I can do. It's so scary. The future is not mine. What's the point in getting up today? And I was stuck in that state for quite a long time. And it wasn't necessarily at the beginning only of my journey, it's also been scattered throughout the middle. But the point here is just to understand that climate anxiety is this feeling of doom, and it can be paralyzing for a lot of people, myself included. Today, though, I'm talking specifically about climate anxiety in the Philippines. Now, climate anxiety in the Philippines has a very different face than it does for the rest of the world, I think. And that this doesn't only apply to the Philippines, but because I live in the Philippines, it's what I have the best vantage point of. The unique difference here is that it isn't theoretical anymore. In the Philippines, we don't only see climate catastrophes, climate change, uh, the climate crisis as a theoretical concept. It's something that we live day to day. It's something that we see not just in small amounts, it's something we see in large economic changes. It's something we see in large catastrophes that hit our country over and over again. And it's something that I myself have witnessed time and time again, right? One of the most heartbreaking statistics I've ever heard that I've probably brought up in a video before is that 97% of young people in the Philippines have experienced not one, not two, but three types of climate stressors, catastrophes, or disasters. That's insane to me. It's not insane because I haven't experienced it. Of course, I have. I've definitely had more than three in my lifetime living here in the Philippines. But just to put a number to it is kind of crazy. Like, 97% is no small amount. God knows if I got 97% on any of my exams, I would be over the moon. You know what I mean? And so putting it in that way just made me realize just how much of the country is going through the things that sometimes can feel like, oh, it's only happening to me, or oh, it's only happening to my town, it's only happening to my city, but it's happening to everyone in very different and very causal ways. And so, what I'd like to explore here is the fact that climate anxiety doesn't exist alone in the Philippines because of how systemic And because of how quickly these disasters strike over and over again, we're not only in a state of anxiety for our futures, we're also in a state of guilt from our pasts. Not only guilt, but grief. Grief is really the word that I want to key into here. After every disaster, there's always going to be a sense of grief, right? And even if you haven't lost anything meaningful, especially if you have, the feeling of lost time, the feeling of collective grief as a community for the things you've lost, the days you've lost. I still remember on my 16th birthday, on the day of my 16th birthday, was the first day of Typhoon Odette in Bacolod City, and which is my hometown and where I lived at the time. So I celebrated my birthday in candlelights, not by choice, but because there was no electricity. And we didn't have electricity for the entire week that followed. And it can suck. And just imagining, all the kids that had to do their homework by candlelight because they don't have electricity to research or turn on their usual routines of the computer desk research. It's incredibly disappointing, but at the same time, there's a very strong sense of grief there. I am grieving the childhood that I could have had, but more importantly, I'm grieving the childhoods of all the young people that are growing up in this state of calamity, you know? And at the same time, I'm anxious. We are all anxious for the things that are coming or the disasters that are to come because it would be beyond wishful thinking. In fact, it would be ignorant thinking to believe that this isn't going to happen again. Not only that it's not going to happen again, but it's not going to happen again quicker, stronger, and worse than ever before. Because that's how the climate crisis works. It's exponential. And what happens today will only be 10 times tomorrow. So, this is where we're going to get into the paradox of climate anxiety, right? I mentioned in the beginning of this video that climate anxiety for me was paralysis. And so we're in this state of paralysis, but we care so much. It's like the more we care, the more we can't act. And so the people who are caring, the people who care, ultimately are not being used in the movement because they literally don't see the point in it anymore. And so this is where a lot of the movements around hope and around action come in. And that's absolutely great. But it's also important to not only understand, but acknowledge that climate anxiety can make you bedridden. It did for me. And it can turn you off of action because knowledge or knowing about all these things is ultimately already anxiety inducing. And so there is this paradox of inaction, right? Where we go in this loop of being anxious and not being able to act, and being anxious again and not being able to act, and being anxious again and not being able to act, and trying to look for a breaking point in that. But before we talk about solutions and what I think are possible breaking points, I want to talk about the symptoms and medicalizing of climate anxiety, right? Anxiety is a mental health term, right? We use it as a medical term, and its symptoms are very cognizant, are very similar to the symptoms of climate anxiety. But I want to draw a very distinct line in the sand here that climate anxiety doesn't always mean that you have a medical condition. It doesn't always mean that it is a medical mental health concern because ultimately, as studies show, climate anxiety isn't necessarily a mental health concern. It is a natural response to the knowledge of impending doom and catastrophe, especially in countries like the Philippines, where this is happening all the time. It's impossible really to live without anxiety or fear of what's to come and grief of what has. And so I want to kind of destigmatize what might be the stigma around the word anxiety, because although there is nothing wrong with having medical concerns in terms of mental health, ultimately climate anxiety doesn't always have to be one of them. There are, of course, extreme cases where it might fall into that category, but I would say a lot of the times climate anxiety is in fact just a natural response to everything that's happening. And this is where I go into the idea of Schrodinger's anxiety. If you guys don't know, this is a play on the term Schrodinger's cat, which is a thought experiment where if there is a cat in a box, it could be dead or it could be alive, and you don't really know. In the same way, when I think about climate anxiety, it could be anxiety and it could be not, and you don't really know. It's kind of a stupid example, but I do think it works in my mind. It helps me conceptualize this. Specifically, I think it's interesting because climate anxiety has been a really up and coming topic where a lot of people are discussing it. And one of the things I don't see discussed enough is the fact that it's a natural response. It is literally probably the most normal response to all the information that we know as a scientific community about the climate crisis. It is angering, but most importantly, it is something that causes fear and anxiety. And that is ultimately the key of this Schrodinger's anxiety idea. We are one of the countries most affected, yet many feel powerless. Some deny, some joke, some ignore, some become activists like me, some burn out, many burn out, some stop reading the news entirely. And so, while these catastrophes and these societal symptoms continue progressing, our individual symptoms do as well, but they do in very different ways. And so at this junction, at this junction, I want to talk about three solutions from my perspective that I think might be able to help you if you're someone that's struggling with climate anxiety, because it is a real thing that we experience, even though it is a natural response. It's still something that is a struggle in daily life. Number one is understanding that information is anxiety and accepting that and drawing the line in the sand for you specifically. So for me, I used to read the news every day, even multiple times a day, and that made it even harder for me to act because it was so difficult constantly seeing bad news. Am I saying you shouldn't read the news entirely? Absolutely not. But I'm saying to pick a schedule, I guess, that works for you, and try to balance the bad news with the good news, because there is a lot of good news out there and there are a lot of communities fighting for a better future, which is leading me to my second point of taking that information and our need for constant understanding and it into participation. So, participation in the sense that you can look for a local organization. The Arrow Project is open for volunteers, but you can look for a local organization in your locality, in your city, in your barangay, in your school, and try to participate. This is always going to be my number one advice for this specific issue, because Action is always going to be, at least for me, the best antidote to this anxious feeling that we all get, getting that sense of control back, you know. And lastly is to learn when to zoom in and when to zoom out. So what I mean by zoom in is think of things from an individual perspective. And when I say zoom out, I mean think of things from a systemic perspective. So this is kind of a difficult line to toe, but I would say, for example, in terms of action, we should know that we can't necessarily zoom out and allow ourselves to feel burdened by the entire world and the problems of an entire country. We can zoom in and look at the problems of our community and see where we can help address those. But in terms of those negative feelings, that guilt, that grief, that anger, that anxiety, we can't zoom in and put it all on ourselves. We need to be able to zoom out and look at things from a systemic view and understand how these systems interact with one another. I hope that is something that you guys can grasp, um, because I'm not sure if I'm doing the best job at explaining it, but essentially it's just knowing when to take things personally, when to do things personally, and when to understand the systemic nature of the climate crisis. I think, just to end this video out, climate anxiety is a very tricky topic to cover because, number one, it is a very real emotion that many of us face. Number two, although it being a real emotion, it is also something that is a natural consequence of the difficulties of modern life. And number three, there are so many more environmental emotions that come out of climate anxiety. It oftentimes doesn't stop there. And if you want to learn more about different climate emotions, I talk about them on this channel. I also talked about eco rage or environmental anger a couple days ago, weeks. So that's on the channel if you guys want to watch that. Thank you so much. I upload a lot, like every week, a couple times a week. And so if you want to stay tuned, that would mean a lot to me. Subscribe, comment, like, do all the things. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. And yeah, stay cool. Peace.